I created this video to guide students in my online philosophy courses. However, I believe that these ideas would be generally useful. If people were to practice them, then we would get more productive and less destructive conversations on important issues. The first and most important principle is that discussion should focus on truth and validity. If somebody provides an argument, then the legitimate way to respond to that argument is to question whether the premises are true or whether the argument structure is valid. Let me illustrate this with some arguments that I've encountered in recent discussions. Here's an example of an argument that I've encountered in discussions on the merits of capital punishment. Typically, people don't express their arguments in this form, but one skill that I would recommend developing is that of putting people's arguments into this form to better understand what's being said. The argument, as best as I can make out, says the following. Premise 1. Executing somebody for murder involves doing to the prisoner what the prisoner did to their victim, that is, killing them. Premise number 2. What the prisoner did to their victim was wrong, from which we get the conclusion, therefore, executing somebody for murder is wrong. In public discussion, attempts to express an argument like this are often met with abuse and ridicule. This happens regardless of the strength of the argument, and is not useful. A useful and productive response would focus on the premises and the relationship between those premises and the conclusion, and attempt to show that the argument is flawed. I'm going to present a response to this argument, but it's not enough to simply assert your argument sucks. We need a counter-argument, something that works against it. The response that I'll use in this case is to demonstrate the unreasonableness of the argument with a counterexample. The counterexample goes as follows. Premise 1. Imprisoning a kidnapper involves doing to the prisoner what the prisoner did to their victim, that is, imprison them against their will. Premise 2. What the prisoner did to the victim was wrong, and this leads to the conclusion, therefore, imprisoning kidnappers is wrong. There seems to be something wrong with this argument, and the flaw in the argument rests in the first premise. Imprisoning or executing somebody as a punishment for a crime is not doing the same thing to the prisoner that the prisoner did to their victim. The prisoner did not execute or imprison somebody for a crime. And even if they think this is what they did, there are rules and procedures to follow. Those rules and procedures are meant to ensure that the accused is actually guilty of the crime beyond a reasonable doubt, and that reason rather than passion determines the severity of the punishment. That's what's supposed to do. Debate on that subject will have to wait for a different video. What is relevant for this video is that if the original argument opposing capital punishment is any good, then this argument against imprisoning kidnappers must be good as well. But this isn't a good argument. There seems nothing wrong with imprisoning kidnappers. This means that there was a flaw in the original argument as well. It does not provide a good reason to reject capital punishment. That is, unless the defender of that argument can identify a morally relevant difference. Now that we have this example, I want to identify certain features of this response that are important here. First, the response made no reference to the author of the original post. It did not even use the pronouns you or your anywhere in the response. Particularly avoided insulting or derogatory language, such as your problem is, or you obviously chose to ignore something. The response focused specifically on the argument and declared the argument invalid by means of a counterexample. Second, neither the original argument nor the response waved any tribal flags. This talk of tribal flags refers to a way of talking that divides the world into a group of us, who are the models of virtue and wisdom, and them, which is that malevolent group of other who are the source of all of the world's problems and who must be stopped at all costs. Tribal flags include terms like liberal, conservative, Republican, Democrat, progressive, evangelical. One of the main problems with using tribal flags is that almost all premises that contain a tribal term are false. The premise asserts that all individuals who would identify with that tribal flag are alike, and this is seldom the case. The second problem with using these flags is that tribal thinking tends to be closed-minded and emotional. When you use tribal flags in a debate, the people who identify under that flag tend to adopt the attitude that they are under attack, and they close ranks for mutual defense. The use of false premises that cause emotional closed-minded reactions is not helpful in a discussion. My own experience suggests to me that some common flag-waving terms are so poorly defined that when used in an argument, they basically mean the wise and virtuous people who agree with me when used in a positive sense, or those horrible monsters who disagree with me when used in a negative sense. Terms like capitalist and socialist are like this. These terms are so poorly defined that those who use these terms in a debate are often not even talking about the same subject. The best way to avoid derailing a conversation and having it be productive is, instead of waving a tribal flag, simply talk about whether one holds that a particular proposition is true or false, or whether an argument is valid or invalid. Here's another example of an argument and a response that's meant to follow these principles. It begins with an argument for capital punishment. The first premise of that argument states that justice requires a response that is proportional to the crime. This is the principle that the punishment must fit the crime. A punishment of 30 days of torture followed by execution for a crime of littering would lack proportion. On the other hand, a $5 fine for rape or murder is an insult to the victim. The severity of the crime demands a punishment that's more than a slap on the wrist. Premise 2 then states that the only response that is proportional for the crime of murder is the execution of the murderer. The victim is dead. The victim's opportunity to do anything with their lives has been completely taken from them. And the only proportional response is to do the same to the perpetrator. Anything less would fail to take seriously the magnitude of the wrong. This then gives us our conclusion. Justice requires the execution of murderers. Now note that this argument makes no reference to the participants in the debate and waves no tribal flags. Again, we can raise questions as to the strength of this argument by presenting a counterexample. Unless one takes the Confederacy as legitimate, soldiers who served the Confederacy in the Civil War were guilty of murder, taking the lives of innocent people. Those who did not actually kill a soldier were part of a group that killed a soldier. Helping somebody else commit murder is still murder. And for another example, there was the wrongness of slavery itself. What does justice demand in terms of the punishment that is due to an individual who kidnaps another, holds that person in bondage for life, and profits off of their work? If wrongness demands a particular penalty, then virtually nobody paid the proper penalty for slavery. The whole population of the South would have had to have been sentenced to decades in prison at best. However, society at the time opted for lesser penalties, and this suggests one of two premises must be false. Either justice does not require an appropriate response, or the execution of all Confederate soldiers or the long-term imprisonment of all citizens of Southern states is not the proportional response to the crimes of murder and slavery. Now, perhaps there are ways of countering this argument. That's not the point here. The video is not a video about the merits of capital punishment. It aims to provide an illustration of how to make and respond to arguments in discussion. Here, too, the point is that neither the argument nor the response makes a reference to the author or waves any tribal flags. Now let me try a third example. Premise 1. Drug laws are unfairly enforced against black people, perpetuating racial injustice. Premise 2. Laws that are unfairly enforced against black people are racist and should be abolished. Conclusion: therefore, drug laws should be abolished. Now, the first point I want to note is that claims like this, even though they mention race and use the term racist, do not violate the principle against using tribal flags. The claim that drug laws are disproportionately used against black people is an empirical claim, supported or not by empirical research. In this case, it seems empirical research supports the premise. But we can still question the argument. The evidence suggests that all criminal laws are unfairly enforced against blacks, including laws against assault, theft, rape, and murder. The response to this type of institutional injustice is not to abolish the laws against assault, theft, rape, and murder, but to remove systematic injustices from the enforcement of all laws, including drug laws. Now, another point to keep in mind is this. The fact that an argument is a bad argument doesn't mean that the conclusion is false. If I were to say that a particular plane is going to crash because I performed an augury and the spirit world told me that it will crash, that would be a bad argument. It provides no good reason to believe that the plane will crash. However, the fact that I used a bad argument doesn't mean that the plane will not crash. Similarly, the weaknesses of this argument against drug legalization does not prove that drugs should be illegal. It only means that the person arguing for drug legalization needs a different and better argument. Now, arguments, as I mentioned, are typically not presented in this type of argument format. Arguments are presented in paragraph format. So, when being provided with an argument for banning guns, one might see something like the following. Quote, the United States has one of the highest rates of gun violence in the developed world. Each year, tens of thousands of lives are lost, and countless more are affected by gun-related injuries. Prohibiting civilian gun ownership would significantly reduce this alarming toll. Now, one can take that paragraph and try to put the argument into an argument format in order to make it easier to understand. That would look something like this. Premise 1, tens of thousands of lives are lost in the United States each year due to gun violence. That premise seems to be true. Premise 2, reducing the number of deaths would be a good thing. Obviously true. Premise 3, a prohibition on gun ownership would reduce the number of deaths. And conclusion, therefore, a prohibition on gun ownership would be a good thing. Some people might want to question premise 3. It's an empirical question. It could be false. One would need to ask a sociologist if it were true or false. But for purposes of this class, let's grant this for the sake of argument. This is a common move in philosophy. You don't need to argue against every single point. With a bit of research, I found the following statistics. The Pew Research Center reports that in 2021, there were 48,830 firearm-related fatalities in the United States, about evenly split between killing others and killing oneself. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention estimates 140,000 alcohol-related deaths per year. The CDC also estimates 480,000 smoking-related deaths per year, including 41,000 deaths due to secondhand smoke. When it comes to killing other people, smokers kill twice as many people as those with guns. So again, if the previous argument for prohibiting guns was any good, it seems we may have a stronger argument for prohibiting alcohol and smoking. If one was truly interested in saving lives, it seems to make sense to go after the tobacco companies first, the alcohol companies second, and the gun companies third. Now here's another point to keep in the back of your head. There are always two ways to resolve a conflict of this type. One can say, go ahead and ban alcohol and nicotine. Or one can say, don't ban guns. But this at least suggests that it may be inconsistent to argue for gun prohibition while at the same time arguing for drug legalization. Now, on this issue of empirical evidence, my policy is to go with the consensus of those who are experts in their field. And this does not mean hunting down those experts who are saying what I want them to say. It means asking what the bulk of the people in that field are saying. I don't expect to be able to do a few minutes of internet research and debunk the claims of those who've investigated a subject for 30 years or more. On the other hand, within my field of study, I'm more than happy to question the positions of experts in the field. I come to my conclusions not on the basis of a few minutes of internet research, but on years assessing the arguments, and that makes a difference. Now, I suspect that as you considered the arguments that I presented here, you came up with answers and objections of your own. That's good. That's as it should be. We advance the discussion by considering reasoned arguments for accepting or rejecting the relevant conclusions. You're free to post your own arguments and counter-arguments, and maybe we can migrate towards the most reasonable and rational position. The purpose of this presentation has been to provide an illustration of the types of things that I'm looking for in discussion. It applies not only to graded and ungraded class assignments, but to any public forum where people are debating important issues. It's my hope that by following these principles, we can create discussions that generate more light and less heat. And I look forward to your arguments.